After 30 years negotiating crises as a U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, I thought retirement would mean peace. My dream home in Maple Ridge Estates, a garden of rare crops I'd collected from remote villages worldwide. These weren't just plants. They were heritage varieties worth $53,000, tied to a UN biodiversity project for food security and medicine. I never imagined they'd spark an international incident. It started on a Tuesday, watering my seedlings, purple Afghan carrots, drought-resistant Peruvian beans, when Alina Whitfield's shadow fell over me. Clipboard in hand, pearls gleaming, she snapped, "Those garden boxes break our rules." I set down my can calm. "Good afternoon, Alina. Section 4.3 of the bylaws allows raised beds." I checked. Her eyes narrowed. "Maybe, but those odd vegetables are unsightly. The HOA expects manicured lawns." I smiled, explaining, "These are nearly extinct varieties. Some could save lives in harsh climates." She tapped her pen, unmoved. "I don't care if they're magic beans from the moon, they're messy. Neighbors complained. The board meets Thursday. Clean this up or we'll act." She strode off as Victor, my neighbor, nodded sympathetically from his porch. That night, Victor texted, "Watch out, Alina killed my bird sanctuary with $900 in fines." I sighed, gazing at my garden in the fatting light. These plants weren't a hobby, they were UN-sanctioned, some studied for cancer treatments, others for starving regions. Next morning, a notice hit my mailbox. "Violation, unapproved landscape modifications," signed by Douglas Montgomery, HOA president. I met him at the community center, a silver-haired man uneasy at my handshake. "Ambassador Taylor, rules are rules, no exceptions," he said. I opened my laptop, showing photos of drought-stricken kids. "This UN project develops resilient crops, it's not just personal." He shifted. "Noble but property values come first. Unusual gardens hurt sales." Section 8.2 allows sustainability initiatives, I countered. His face hardened. "The board decides Alina's logged violations." My phone rang, my UN assistant. "Secretary General's visit next week to see the crops is confirmed." My stomach tightened. "Small local issue first," I muttered. That night, I saw Alina and Douglas photographing my garden, their focus unnerving. I flew to Geneva for an emergency UN meeting, leaving a security camera over my garden and Victor on watch. "Those HOA bullies wield rules like weapons," he warned. 3 days later, landing back home, my phone buzzed with Victor's frantic messages. "Come now, something terrible happened to your garden." Speeding to Maple Ridge, my heart raced. Storm damage, theft, worse awaited. Victor met me grim. "I'm sorry I tried to stop them." My backyard was a graveyard, every plant wilted, soil reeking of chemicals. Afghan carrots, Myanmar herbs, all dying, 3 years of work poisoned. "Who?" I whispered. Victor showed his video, Alina and Douglas, gloved and masked, spraying my garden with skull-marked containers. "They said it was approved weed control," he said, "but that's poison." Rage replaced shock. "These were humanity's heritage, some irreplaceable." Tomorrow, the Secretary General would see this ruin, a UN project gutted. "Send me that video," I said, voice calm but steel hard. "I'll make a call and teach them diplomacy's consequences." Sleep fled as I saw my plants dying in my mind, Alina and Douglas oblivious to the storm they'd unleashed. Sleepless, I watched dawn break over my poisoned garden, the stench of chemicals clinging to the air. 3 years of irreplaceable work, rare crops tied to UN food security, destroyed by HOA pettiness. By morning, I'd mapped my counterstrike, calls to UN security, the Secretary General's office, and a final review of Maple Ridge's bylaws, not as a homeowner but as a diplomat who'd faced worse than Alina Whitfield. At 9:00 a.m., my doorbell rang. Alina, Douglas, and 2 board members stood there, her smile vanishing at my expression. "Ambassador Taylor," she chirped, "we noticed you removed those unsightly plants. Thank you for complying." I didn't invite them in. Be clear, Alina, I didn't remove anything. You trespassed and poisoned UN food security crops." Douglas stepped up. "We sent notices. When you didn't comply, we remedied it." I played Victor's video on my phone, their faces paling as they saw themselves spraying my garden. "That's an invasion of privacy," Alina sputtered. "No," I said. "Destroying protected specimens on my property is. Those weren't ordinary plants. Some don't exist outside remote villages." Douglas blustered. "The rules don't permit poisoning," I cut in. "Section 8.2 exempts conservation projects. My garden qualified." Aliner's face reddened. Rules apply to everyone. Your job doesn't make you special. A black SUV with diplomatic plates rolled up. Maria, my chief security officer, stepped out. Everything all right, Ambassador? She asked, eyeing them. These are the ones who destroyed UN property, I said. Douglas frowned. UN property? This is a neighborhood. I handed him a folder, documentation of the Global Seed Preservation Initiative. Those plants belong to humanity, studied for medical breakthroughs. Alina flipped through, frantic. How were we supposed to know? I told you repeatedly, I said. Maria checked her phone. The Secretary General's been briefed. He's called an emergency HOA meeting this afternoon. Alina balked. The UN Secretary General over plants. Over $53,000 in rare specimens for humanitarian aid, I corrected. He takes it seriously. Douglas whispered to Alina, panic clear. He turned back. A misunderstanding will pay $500 for the plants. I nearly laughed. The Afghan purple carrot was $8,000, $1 of 3 in the Western Hemisphere. Maria showed me a text. Secretary General's team at airport, media notified. Media? Alina squeaked. Yes, I said. Endangered species destruction is news, especially for UN projects. Douglas pulled me aside. Can we resolve this quietly? Emergency meeting, 2 hours, full board, bring the bylaws, I replied. After they left, Victor approached with a potted seedling, the rare Himalayan medicinal herb I'd thought lost, saved weeks earlier. Not sure what it is, he said, but it might help. Tears pricked my eyes. It promised cancer treatment potential. Victor, you may have saved lives, I said, cradling it. Neighbors gathered as word spread, sharing HOA horror stories, fines, threats, petty tyranny. My phone rang, UN security confirming the Secretary General's arrival. Media vans lined up as Maria said, "It's time." I gathered evidence, Victor's video, bylaws, plant documentation, soil samples proving toxic chemicals. At the community center, the crowd swelled, news cameras, diplomatic SUVs, neighbors buzzing. The Secretary General strode toward me, grim. Ambassador Tyler, he said, shaking my hand, show me what happened to our plants. I led him to the wreckage, his face hardening at the wilted remains. This wasn't just a garden, I said. It was hope for millions. He nodded. This is bigger than Maple Ridge now. Inside, Alina and Douglas awaited, oblivious to the storm I'd summoned. My diplomatic immunity shielded me, but my connections would bury them. They'd poisoned more than plants. They'd ignited an international reckoning. Sirens wailed as 3 black SUVs with diplomatic plates screeched to a halt outside the Maple Ridge Community Center. I straightened my tie, took a breath, and pushed through the doors into the emergency HOA meeting. Alina leapt up, face flushed. What's the meaning of this? We're discussing community matters. Silence fell as my security team filed in, neighbors gaping, some filming. Poisoning my garden is a community matter, I said, voice carrying, especially since it was part of a United Nations Environmental Sustainability Initiative. Douglas laughed nervously. Ambassador Taylor, we get you're upset about vegetables, but this is dramatic. I turned my tablet to the crowd, showing before and after photos of my rare crops. Not vegetables, drought-resistant species to feed millions. I swiped to Victor's footage. Alina and Douglas spraying poison at 2:00 a.m. Gasps erupted. You sent 3 notices, Alina shouted, voice cracking. Rules are rules, an older woman stood. I got fined $200 for a flower box 2 inches too wide, but poisoning's fine. The notices were for lawn maintenance, I said, not destroying $53,000 in UN property. Douglas's smirk faded. Wait, you're a serving U.S. ambassador. I placed my credentials down. Yes, those were sanctioned specimens for humanitarian research. The room exploded, neighbors yelling at the board. Alina banged her gavel. This changes nothing, rules apply to all. The doors swung open again. Secretary General Ockaper entered stern. Ambassador Taylor, are these the crops showing promise for sustainable agriculture? Cameras flashed as neighbors pressed against windows, watching the HOA squirm. Douglas tried. This is private, Victor cut in. State law says it's public, striding forward with a folder. The HOA has no jurisdiction over garden plants. He spread documents. Section 8.3 excludes agricultural plantings under 3 feet, added in 2007 for urban agriculture. The treasurer gasped. 5 years on the board, I never saw that. Victor smirked. Certain bylaws were omitted from new member copies. I have proof. Alina lunged for the papers. Ridiculous. Outside, the crowd doubled. Douglas grabbed his briefcase. Meeting adjourned. Not so fast, a security officer blocked him. FBI wants to talk about protected species destruction. My phone buzzed, State Department. Potential violation of 3 conservation treaties, legal team en route. Alina bolted for a side door, shoving an elderly neighbor down. Need something from my car, she yelled. I nodded to my team. Don't let her destroy evidence. Ocapper gripped my shoulder. This is beyond a neighborhood dispute now. Victor handed me a paper Alina dropped, whispering, look at this. My heart stopped. Pinewood Luxury Condominiums, Douglas's company logo, my lot circled as priority target for their entrance. They needed your land, Victor said. Alina burst back in, guards behind her, phone seized. She was deleting messages, one reported. My tech specialist projected them, hundreds of violation photos, texts plotting to pressure homeowners out. Mrs. Abernathy sobbed. They fined me $500 for gnomes. I skipped medicine to pay. The dam broke, neighbors shouted. 3 paint approvals. Fine for a bird feeder, Alina has 3. Solar panels rejected, but hers passed. Phones lit up, posts spreading. Douglas backed against the wall as Victor climbed a chair. Retired environmental lawyer, I've documented 3 years of selective enforcement targeting the elderly, minorities, dissenters. This is criminal. Janet Kim from the County Housing Authority stepped in. I'm interested. Detective Marcus Williams added, Financial Crimes Unit, we've watched Douglas's company for months. Douglas paled. I want my lawyer. A reporter nabbed Alina outside. Comment on poisoning an ambassador's garden for your condos. No comment, she shoved past. Inside, Victor's map showed targeted homes, perfectly matching the condo footprint. They'd turned pettiness into a conspiracy, and my garden was their misstep into a trap they couldn't escape. The Maple Ridge Community Center pulsed with fury as Victor's map lit up the projector, red-marked homes tracing the Pinewood condominium's footprint, my garden the linchpin. Neighbors surged, voices overlapping. Fined $2,000 for wind chimes, I took a loan. Cited for wedding flowers. Victor scrolled Alina's texts. Old Mrs. Jenkins won't sell, fined violations. Ambassador's garden goes, investors need that corner. Target the Rodriguez family, can't fight fines. A young mom cradled her baby. $500 for drying clothes, Alina's daughter has a clothesline. Douglas edged toward the back exit, deleting emails. Stop him, I called. Security nabbed him, recovering messages, spreadsheets tracking $300,000 in fines over 3 years, notes on vulnerable residents. Most unreported in HOA statements, Victor announced. Where'd it go? A stunned board member asked. Detective Williams stepped up. Financial fraud across state lines, federal offense. Douglas stammered. Just enforcing rules. Rules you changed without votes, Victor countered, showing altered bylaws, 17 unapproved shifts. Phones buzzed, social media ablaze. Emergency vote to dissolve the board. Class action lawsuit. Williams organized statements as Janet Kim from the Housing Authority took notes. Secretary General Ocapper watched, amazed. Ambassador Taylor, I came for crops, now it's grassroots democracy. I smiled grimly. Justice needs both diplomacy and action. My security leader rushed in, evidence bag in hand. Found this buried in your garden, post-poisoning deeds, bank transfers, a priority removals list with your name tops. Victor whispered, they planted it to frame you later. Alina, spotting it, whispered to Douglas, who bolted. Officers stopped him. Her seized phone buzzed with damning texts, schedules tracked, homes targeted when empty. They've watched us like hawks, an elderly man muttered. Fine for my grandson's car, Victor pulled property records. Your lots where Douglas bought 3 adjacent parcels, they needed it for condos. A chill hit me. The poisoning wasn't just rules, it was eviction by force. Ocapper examined the evidence. This violates the Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources. Those crops were protected. The crowd pressed closer, anger palpable. My tech specialist projected Douglas's bank records, HOA dues funneled to his company as consulting fees. They used fines for bonuses, Victor said. Mrs. Abernathy stood, frail. Lost my Meadowbrook home to this, foreclosed after fines. Now here too. Neighbors formed groups, exchanging numbers. A reporter nabbed Alina outside. Poisoning for condos? She shoved past. Inside, chaos reigned until Victor rushed over, tablets shaking. Alina's garage, it's not just money, the development company's a front. The screen showed ownership, a name from my diplomatic days tied to foreign interests nowhere near U.S. real estate, national security stakes. "Call Washington," I said quietly. "Now." 3 months later, Rain tapped a secure D.C. conference room as the FBI director slid me a folder. "Your garden cracked a bigger case. Douglas's company laundered for foreign entities near sensitive sites." Alina, initially unwitting, joined for profit once she knew. "Serious charges ahead," she said. Back home, scientists tended my garden's lone survivor, the Himalayan blue poppy, in a greenhouse. Dr. Patel beamed. "Its compound neutralizes water contaminants, huge for drought zones." From one seedling, hope bloomed. Victor called from court. HOA dissolved, neighborhood voted a community land trust. That night, neighbors filled the old HOA room, planning gardens, playgrounds. Strangers turned allies. Mrs. Jenkins offered her late husband's seeds, eyes wet. "He'd love this." Media swarmed. "How's it feel triggering a congressional probe?" I smiled. "Small seeds, big changes." Across the street, Alina was escorted out, glaring as agents boxed evidence. My garden's poison had uprooted more than plants. It had exposed a rot far deeper than Maple Ridge. Spring rain nourished Maple Ridge as I knelt beside new garden beds, the poisoned soil reborn through months of UN scientists' work. The Himalayan blue poppy's seedlings thrived in a greenhouse, its compound now key to water purification talks at the UN. From destruction, renewal sprouted. 3 months prior, Alina's glare had pierced me as agents hauled evidence from her home, texts, photos, plans tying her and Douglas to a foreign money laundering scheme via Pinewood condominiums. The FBI director's words echoed. "Your garden cracked it open, serious charges loom." Douglas, ankle-monitored, skulked past daily, silent under legal gag. That night in D.C., my secure phone rang the Secretary of State. "Those plant compounds are central to climate talks. We need you back at the UN now." I'd packed fast, leaving Mrs. Jenkins to tend the garden. "We'll care for them while you fight," she'd said, emotional. "It's about community and justice." A kid's package waited at my door, cards and a plaque. "Ambassador of plants and people, sometimes the worst poison reveals the strongest roots." Back home, the HOA was dead, replaced by a community land trust after Victor's courthouse win. Neighbors gathered in the old meeting room, once sterile, now warm with shared food and plans, gardens, playgrounds, no more fines. Mrs. Jenkins handed me her husband's seed collection. "A botanist. He'd love your work." I nodded, teary. "They'll join the project." Media vans lingered, the story national. A poisoned garden exposing HOA corruption, foreign schemes, and sparking anti-predatory HOA laws. "Triggered a congressional probe? How's it feel?" a reporter shouted as I grabbed mail. "Small seeds, big changes," I replied. Before Congress, I'd testified, foreign investments hiding in HOAs, a security gap my garden revealed. Lawmakers united, reforms brewing. "You saved endangered species, too," the chair noted. The Secretary General cut the ribbon on our Biodiversity Education Center, hands dirty from planting with kids. "From ruin, renewal," he said. Victor found me by the beds, flourishing with UN and volunteer effort. "Ever imagine your hobby doing this?" He handed me the class action settlement, compensation for HOA victims. I shook my head. "I wanted peace to grow plants." Across the street, Douglas darted to his car, neighbors starring. His trial loomed, a national security case. At the community center, Janet Kim and Detective Williams briefed residents. $300,000 in fines traced to Douglas's firm, a front for foreign interests near government sites. Alina, complicit for profit, faced justice too. Mrs. Abernathy, once foreclosed, led a gardening group, her gnome fines repaid. "They took my Meadowbrook home, now we fight back," she said. Social media buzzed, #Maple Ridge rising, spreading the movement. My diplomatic phone rang late, UN research. "The poppies compound, it's a game changer for refugee camps. EPA's probing Douglas's toxin too, undisclosed impacts." Next day, sirens woke me, FBI at Alina again. Victor rushed over, tablet trembling. "Her garage, more than money, look who owns the development company." A name from my UN days tied to a hostile state banned from US dealings. "A front," he whispered. "National security." I'd called Washington that night, briefing escalating. Now rain softened as I stood in the garden, moonlight glinting off the greenhouse. Scientists worked late, seeds promising clean water for millions. A tiny sprout my Afghan carrot poked through, stubborn as me. Mrs. Jenkins joined me, watering can in hand. "Your husband's seeds are next," I said. She smiled. "He'd say you turned poison into power." Beyond, the community thrived, colored doors, kids, laughter, no more clipboard tyrants. Alina and Douglas had aimed to break me. Instead, they'd sown a revolution, my rare crops the spark that lit it. The UN awaited, but here, roots grew deeper than they'd ever imagined. The Maple Ridge dusk hummed with life as I stood by the greenhouse, its soft glow cradling the Himalayan blue poppy seedlings, survivors of Alina's poison, now poised to purify water for millions. 3 months had reshaped everything. The HOA dissolved, a community land trust rose, and my garden's ruin exposed a foreign laundering scheme. Victor's garage find, a name tied to a hostile state owning Douglas's development front, had jolted Washington. My secure phone rang that night, the Secretary of State urgent. "Your plants are climate talk leverage, UN now." I'd left at dawn, Mrs. Jenkins promising, "We'll guard them." Kids, cards, and a plaque, ambassador of plants and people, rode with me, a reminder of roots stronger than poison. Back home, spring beds flourished, a UN neighbor collab. The Biodiversity Education Center buzzed. Secretary General Ockhapper's ribbon cutting still echoed. From destruction, renewal. Media swarmed, Maple Ridge rising viral. HOA reform bills brewing nationwide. Victor jogged over, tablet in hand. "Alina's trial starts tomorrow. FBI's got more. Her phone's a gold mine." I'd seen it, texts plotting my ouster. "Ambassador's garden goes. Investors need it by September." Photos tracked neighbors. Fines targeted the vulnerable. "They used the HOA to extort," he said. $300,000 funneled to Douglas's firm. Detective Williams confirmed it, federal fraud plus national security charges. Douglas, ankle monitored, scurried past daily, silent. Alina's glare from her evidence-laden exit lingered. Mrs. Abernathy, once foreclosed, tended new beds, gnome fines repaid. "They took my last home, now we win," she said. Congress heard my testimony, HOAs as foreign fronts, a gap my garden exposed. "You saved species too," they'd noted. The UN research team called. "The poppies compound, it's revolutionary for camps. EPA's on Douglas's toxin, illegal impacts." A tiny Afghan carrot sprouted defiant. That night the community center pulsed. Neighbors, once strangers, planned gardens, playgrounds. Mrs. Jenkins handed me her husband's seeds. "He'd love this fight." I nodded, choked. "They're next to plant." Janet Kim briefed us. Douglas's firm a front for a state ban from U.S. real estate near sensitive sites. "Alina turned willing for cash," she said. Social media flared. Residents nationwide shared HOA horror, reforms gaining steam. My diplomatic line buzzed. UN. "Climate talks hinge on your crops, back soon." I packed, but lingered by the beds. Rain fell, healing. Colored doors gleamed. Kids laughed. No more clipboard shadows. Victor grinned. "Your hobby did this." "I just wanted peace," I said. Across, Douglas darted to his car, neighbor's eyes cold. His trial loomed, a security case now. Next dawn, FBI vans hit Alina again. Victor rushed up, breathless. "Her garage deeper than we thought." His tablet showed ownership docs, a figure I'd faced in UN standoffs linked to espionage. "They needed your lot for access," he whispered. "Washington's freaking out." I'd briefed them that night, escalation confirmed. Scientists in the greenhouse worked late, poppy seeds promising refugee aid. Mrs. Jenkins joined me, watering. "Your husband's legacy grows," I said. She smiled. "You turned poison to power." The community thrived, trust, not tyranny. Alina and Douglas aimed to crush me. Instead, they'd sparked a reckoning. My plane awaited, but I knelt by that carrot sprout, stubborn like me, like Maple Ridge. A reporter shouted, "Congressional probe, your thoughts?" "Small seeds, big change," I called back. Beyond, the land healed, roots digging deep. At the UN, I briefed Ockhapper, poppy compounds, clinched aid deals. "Your garden's a diplomatic coup," he said. Back home, Victor texted. "Alina's pleading, Douglas flipped." The condo plan was their trap, my plants sprang mine. From pettiness, a global shift, community, justice, resilience blooming where poison once reigned. I'd wanted retirement, I got revolution, and Maple Ridge stood taller for it. The UN chamber buzzed as I presented the Himalayan blue poppy's breakthrough. Its compound now a cornerstone of climate aid deals, clean water for millions on the horizon. Secretary General Ockhapper leaned in post-briefing. "Your garden's a diplomatic triumph, ambassador born from poison." I nodded, the irony sharp. Back in Maple Ridge, Victor's text hit mid-flight. Eleanor's pleading guilty, Douglas flipped, spilling everything. Their condo scheme, my corner lot as the prize, had unraveled a foreign front tied to espionage, my rare crops the tripwire. Landing home, spring air carried renewal, garden beds thrived, a UN neighbor effort, the greenhouse aglow with poppy seedlings. Mrs. Jenkins met me, watering her husband's seeds, now sprouting beside mine. He'd marvel at this, she said, eyes bright. Poison to power. Across the street, Douglas's car was gone, trial prep, ankle monitor, and all. Eleanor's house sat dark, agents' visits routine now. The community center hummed that night. Neighbors planned a playground, no HOA shadows. Victor slid me the class action payout, $300,000 in fines were paid to victims like Mrs. Abernathy, whose gnomes bloomed again. Eleanor's deal cuts her time, Douglas named names, he said. Detective Williams briefed us. The development firm laundered for a hostile state near a military base, my lot their access key. Eleanor joined for profit once she knew, he added. Janet Kim from the Housing Authority nodded. National reforms are drafting, your garden sparked it. Media vans lingered, Maple Ridge rising trended, HOA abuses trending nationwide. A reporter nabbed me. Congressional probe, your take? Small seeds, big change, I said, mail in hand, kids, cards thanking plant ambassador. Congress had grilled me, HOAs as security gaps, my testimony fueling laws. Saved species too, they'd said. The Biodiversity Education Center thrived. Ockapper's ribbon-cutting words lingered. From ruin, renewal. Kids learned frog calls on wetland trails. Sarah Rodriguez, fined for clotheslines, led a garden crew, her baby giggling nearby. They targeted us to break us, she said. Now we build. My phone rang, UN research. Poppy's a game changer, EPA's suing over Douglas's toxin, undisclosed damage. That Afghan carrot sprouted taller, defiant. Victor grinned by the beds. Retirement hobby to revolution. Just wanted peace, I laughed. FBI hit Eleanor. Again, more docs tying her to the foreign name I'd faced intense UN talks. They needed your land for surveillance, Victor whispered. Washington's reeling. I'd briefed them, escalation locked in. Mrs. Jenkins joined, proud. Communities, your legacy too. Colored doors gleamed, trust replaced tyranny. Eleanor's poison birthed resilience. Next day, a secure call, Secretary of State. Your crops clinched aid, back for treaty talks. I packed, lingering by the greenhouse. Scientists worked late, seeds promising refugee camps relief. Mrs. Abernathy waved, tending beds. They took my last home, here we won. Social media flared, reform bills gained steam, Maple Ridge a beacon. Douglas darted past, neighbors' stares cold, his trial loomed, a security case now. Eleanor's plea hearing aired, her glare faded to defeat. My garden's wreck had uprooted a conspiracy, their trap sprang mine. At the UN, Ockapper clapped my shoulder. From pettiness, global good. Home, Victor texted. Settlement, out, community trust funded. Night fell, rain healing. I knelt by that carrot, stubborn as me. Mrs. Jenkins smiled. Your husband's seeds grow justice too. Beyond, Maple Ridge stood tall, roots deeper than poison could reach, a revolution I never planned but wouldn't trade. Summer sun bathed Maple Ridge as I stood by the thriving garden beds, the Himalayan blue poppy seedlings now robust in the greenhouse. A lifeline for drought zones, its compound a UN triumph. 8 months since Eleanor's poison, the HOA was a memory, replaced by a community land trust funded by the class action win, $300,000 back to neighbors like Mrs. Abernathy, whose gnomes dotted her yard again. Victor's text from the courthouse lingered. Eleanor's sentenced 5 years. Douglas got 10, foreign ties sealed it. Their condo plot, my lot the key, unmasked a laundering front for a hostile state. My rare crops sparked the fall. The Biodiversity Education Center buzzed. Kids explored trails. Sarah Rodriguez taught gardening, her baby toddling nearby. They find me to break me, she said. Now we bloom. Mrs. Jenkins joined me, her husband's seeds sprouting beside mine. He'd say you turned poison to victory, she smiled. The community center pulsed with plans, playgrounds, no more clipboard tyrants. Detective Williams briefed us last week. Douglas's firm hid funds near a base, your garden stopped it. Janet Kim added, HOA reforms law now Maple Ridge led. Media faded, but Maple Ridge Rising echoed nationwide, colored doors, shared meals, trust reborn. My UN talks clinched aid, poppy seeds headed to camps. A diplomatic coup, Ockapper had said. Back home, the EPA sued over Douglas's toxin, environmental havoc undisclosed. That Afghan carrot stood tall, stubborn as me. Victor grinned. Hobby to history. Just wanted peace, I replied. FBI raids on Alina's garage found docs linking her to a name I'd faced in UN standoffs, espionage stakes. They needed your land for eyes on the base, Victor said. Washington still reeled. I'd briefed them, case escalating. Congress hailed me, HOAs as security gaps plugged, species saved. Small seeds, big change, I'd told reporters, kids, plaque, ambassador of plants, and my desk. The trust-funded beds where Mrs. Abernathy gardened repaid for her foreclosure scars. They took my last home, here we rose, she said. Social media flared, reform laws spread, Maple Ridge a model. My secure phone rang, Secretary of State. Your crops anchor treaties, UN soon. I packed, lingering by the greenhouse. Scientists prepped seeds for refugee relief. Douglas monitored, slunk past, neighbors' eyes cold, trial done. Alina's house sold, her rain dust. My garden's ruins sprang their trap, mine rewrote the story. Night fell, moonlight on the beds, rain had healed the poisoned soil. Mrs. Jenkins handed me lemonade. Your husband's legacy thrives, I said, choked. Yours too, community justice. Beyond, kids biked past rainbow doors, no fines, just freedom. The center hosted a vote, trust bylaws, fair rules, kids' drawings pinned up. Sarah waved, her clothesline legal now. We're stronger, she said. UN research called, poppy's a global fix, EPA's winning on the toxin. I knelt by that carrot, resilient like us. A reporter lingered, probe to piece thoughts. Roots beat poison, I said. Ockapper's words at the ribbon-cutting rang. From ruin, renewal. Alina and Douglas aimed to crush me. Instead, they sowed a revolution. My plants, their misstep, birthed a community unbowed. Leaving for the UN, Mrs. Abernathy waved. We'll tend it, fight on. My escort arrived. I glanced back, greenhouse aglow, beds alive, trust enduring. Their pettiness gave me more than peace, a legacy of resilience, justice, hope. From $53,000 in lost crops, a nation shifted, a neighborhood stood tall. Sometimes the worst poison grows the strongest roots, I murmured, boarding the plane. Maple Ridge gleamed below, a testament to what small seeds and stubborn souls can do against all odds. I'd sought retirement. I found a reckoning, and the world was better for it.